что ж, время пошло.
All right,
Мой доклад
let's kick off.
«Кризис NVD и светлое будущее».
My presentation is devoted to the crisis of NVD and the bright future. My name is Aleksandr Leonov, and I've been dealing with vulnerability management since 2009. I work at the Security Expert Center at Positive. I have my own PT Expert Security channel. Please visit me, like my channel. What are we going to discuss? We'll be discussing two systems, the National Vulnerability Database and the Russian FDU stack. We will also discuss the crisis I mentioned, and we'll also consider the most interesting vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities that are only present in our system. What is NVD, the National Vulnerability Database? It's the biggest vulnerability database, 250,000 vulnerabilities. Last year, 28,000 were added, approximately, so about 78 to 79 per day. Some time ago, recently, in 2016, it might appear that we had twice less vulnerabilities, although we took it for a huge peak. It's not the NVDB that is growing. I'm speaking about another database, which is called CV.org. It's supported by Mitram. How do these two databases interact and relate to each other? Have a look at this diagram. It's pretty hefty. However, I'd like you to pay attention to two columns. Firstly, the large one, which is highlighted blue. This is NVD. And we see only one arrow here, taking us from CV.org to NVD. What does it mean? It means that the vulnerabilities that are present in CV.org go to NVD for additional processing. Link descriptions are added, as well as the severity level, types of vulnerabilities, CWE, as well as the CPE, which is a list of vulnerable platforms. This is number one. And we understand that NVD is the downstream. On the other hand, the database of CV identifiers is directly linked to the organizations that are actually proper authorities, which means that they have authority to assign such CV identifiers, and the number of such authorities started to grow significantly in 2016. And in the same 2016, the number of CVs started to grow. Is it a coincidence? I don't think so. Today, 377 organizations have the CNA status, 46 countries, 108 organizations are located in the USA, and there are questions to those organizations. And I suggest that we consider two cases. One is kernel.org, which works with the Linux kernel vulnerabilities. And the other one is Zero-Day Initiative. What's the problem with the kernel? It's not long ago that they became CV numbering authorities. However, they have been registering vulnerabilities with such a description. If you ever saw such CV descriptions, you will recognize this huge document for description. Usually, it's much more concise. If you look at the vulnerability description, you will see that it's just a bug, rather a bug than a vulnerability.
Если с линуксовым ядром это выглядело как какое-то дополнительные какие-то
And if it would look like some swelling of the database, which is totally unnecessary sometimes,
уязвимости не дозаводят.
vulnerabilities are not brought in enough number, just like in case of zero-day initiative. There were 2 critical vulnerabilities last year, and by the way, you can scan the code out in order to see the vulnerability trends of 2023, the vulnerabilities which are either used now or that may be used in future. And in that report, I highlighted several cases when there was a vulnerability and it has its own identifier, ZDI, and that identifier would be indicated. And then the vendor from INRAR and EMSIN would indicate that CVM identifier, and it is not there in the vulnerability database. So you, for instance, would check the cv.org website and you would not see that. So that means that some vulnerabilities were not reported enough, and it was fixed only on May 3rd. These vulnerabilities were populated into that matrix. There used to be 847 new vulnerabilities reported. Out of them, 719 are the vulnerability 709. These are vulnerabilities that were reported by ZDI. And very often it happens so that the delay was 260 days. 260 days were that was the delay for WinCR vulnerability. These were not critical problems, but these were just minor problems. The real crisis approached totally unnoticed, and it was related to the NVD banner. On that banner,
National Vulnerability Database,
you can read that the organizational structure is going to change, and therefore there might be some delays. There might be some delays in populating the data. So delays doesn't sound strange. 1-2 days, nothing to worry about. But the consortium, okay, let it be consortium. But in essence, it resulted in the following. One day, February 11th, 2024, NVD started reporting the vulnerabilities and didn't comment on that except for the banner on the website. And now it's end of May, and nothing has changed. Backlog on unanalyzed vulnerabilities is extending. 11,000 vulnerabilities have not been analyzed. And on the statistics side, you can see that last week 10 vulnerabilities out of 1,500 vulnerabilities were analyzed. Why this is important? What is wrong about that? So they do not analyze that, but probably that the data that they do not report is not needed by anyone. But on the picture on the right-hand side, you see that this whole infrastructure of detecting vulnerabilities is supported by NVD data, especially in the West. Why? The most critical part there of what NVD adds, these are those expressions that describe vulnerable software, which is subjected to certain vulnerabilities, as CP identifies. That information is available for free. You can download that as feeds, where you can collect that in terms of IP. You can detect the service version as a CPI identifier. For instance, we have a website on some host, and we get the version of that file as a tuple. We actually put the identifier at NVD website, and we get the list of vulnerabilities. That's a very push system. Certainly it has some problems to what extent that CPI identifier was detected very well, and whether vulnerabilities touched that are correct. But this works in many companies did detecting this way. Moreover, there are some free tools that helps to do that. For instance, when map has login vulners NSE provided by vulners.com company. That allows to do what? In essence, it detects this service. It would detect the version of that installed software as a CPI, and then it would use CPI in order to identify the vulnerabilities and along with the exploits, and this is for free. But this has been underlined by the National Vulnerabilities Database, and for 11,000 of vulnerabilities that have not been populated, such detect system doesn't work. How NVD explains that crisis actually doesn't explain it anyhow. Quite recently, end of March, a conference was held in the United States dedicated to vulnerability management. There was a session dedicated to National Vulnerability Database. It was a whole symposium dedicated to that. There is no video recording of that, but there is an article that describes what it discussed. And this is how this problem has been explained. It's been explained by the fact that the budget shrunk the institute that supported the National Vulnerability Database. It's called National Infrastructure Security Standardization Institute of Standardization and Technology. It's called NIST, NIST. Its budget was cut 12%. It was quite huge then, and it is still quite huge, $1.5 billion. This is back to the question as to how much it may cost. So they are dealing not only with National Vulnerability Database and many other things. Secondly, they changed the contractor which worked on NVD, and all of a sudden that company this is a company which builds military ships. Can you take my word for that? So the shipbuilder is populating the tables with vulnerabilities. What else? They said that standards were replaced and some administrative things impeded. And they say that after the consortium assumes the responsibilities, everything would be just great, but the community was not impressed so much. On April 12, an open letter to Congress was written, and the letter said, NVD is a critically important tool to secure the systems against the vulnerabilities. The community is using the data from the native vulnerability database in order to prioritize vulnerabilities. So for many companies, and this is the only source of such vulnerability. And they make reference to some guidelines. The American one about the improvement of the cybersecurity, how we're going to improve cybersecurity if we are short of the main tool. And what they call on us to do, they call on investigating into that case. This is not just a case, but this is a problem of National Vulnerability Database degradation or erosion. And they suggest to investigate into poor communication, to openly discuss how we can improve the description of vulnerabilities in NVD, to consider sustainable funding if money matters, to treat NVD as a key service and to maintain independence of NVD, and most importantly, there has to be one responsible agency responsible for the development of NVD, and this is one of the arguments against the consortium. So what the NVD responded, probably they fixed everything, or I do not know, maybe they provided an answer item by item. Now, as we have seen, number of vulnerabilities which are reported to the database doesn't increase, and NVD just updated the banner, making it longer. So what they write there, that NVD really is an essential element of the national infrastructure, of cybersecurity and the increase of backlog on the vulnerabilities that they failed to analyze may be due to the increase in the number of software. In February, probably, the number of software skyrocketed. And that's why the situation has changed. At the moment, they attach priority importance to the analysis of the top priority vulnerabilities. So before they analyzed all the vulnerabilities, now they're going to analyze the most significant ones. And they try to distribute the resources, human resources somehow, so that there are more analysts who could populate the database with the vulnerabilities. And besides, the consortium would emerge and everything would be just great. Besides publishing that banner, they stopped all the work. They stopped adding new CVEs, not just populating that with anything, but they just stopped reporting on them at all. Many researchers, cybersecurity professionals immediately sounded alarm, saying that probably NVD is closed at all, but 5 days later they resumed to work without any comments. So what about the community? How the community responded to that? What alternatives were offered? There were lots of ideas, so let us make an alternative NVD database. But the question is, who is going to pay for the work of the analysts who consider those vulnerabilities in NVD, who are describing them? I think that now the most reliable, viable solution is to close the gap in terms of the CPE. Two companies said that using artificial intelligence, they are ready to detect such expressions on their own. But sadly, for some part of vulnerabilities, this is the upper part of the slide, of the ponytail. Another initiative proceeds from another American regulator, CISA. What they came up with, they suggested to make a repository on GitHub, CISA enrichment, when they would pick up the most significant vulnerabilities and would enrich that just like the NVD would do. What I must say, so that's great that they try this way to address the problem, at least for the super significant vulnerabilities, but the problem is that they didn't go along with NVD, but they decided to make a standalone repository. And it means that they cannot help the NVD from inside out. And I'm done with my talk about NVD. Let us proceed with the Russian vulnerability database, which is called BDO STEP. Let me start with saying to what extent BDO STEC, whether it can replace NVD. We can look at the numbers, 250,000 CVs and 57,000 in STEC. There are references to CV, so we can proceed from BDU to CV, but it doesn't change the situation dramatically. So it means that the BDU has 50,000 BDUs, and it means that BDU doesn't cover all those vulnerabilities, all those software that National Vulnerability Database has. And it cannot be considered as a substitution to the NVD. Should it be a full-fledged substitution or not? We'll discuss that later on during Q&A. But what I did, I decided to look at the vulnerabilities that BDU alone has, that the NVD doesn't have. So I took all the BDU vulnerabilities and I selected the vulnerabilities with no CV identifier, and I consider them. So we have 55,000 vulnerabilities, and without CV, there would be only 1,400 of them. So you can see such a picture in a different format. And once again, we'll see that this is a tiny part of the total number of vulnerabilities. Is there any tendency regarding increase or decrease? I would say that this is about stabilizing the figure at the level of about 200 vulnerabilities, which are purely BDU without CV identifier per annum. It would be worth making a disclaimer that all those vulnerability data now become outdated very fast. That's why these figures, 55,000, this is the figures of the end of March, when I did my research. But now, this figure is a little bit bigger. As of May 20th, it was 57,000. And without CV identifier, there were no 1,350, but 1,390. So I apologize for that difference in terms of 30 CVs, but it doesn't change the situation dramatically. Let me tell you how I did that analysis. I did it via my Vulnerabilities utility. You can scan a QR code to see that, and it prioritizes the vulnerabilities. Before, we'd allow to prioritize only the CV vulnerability list, but now you can do the same in order to submit the BDU vulnerabilities and such exploit in the wild or private exploit, CSS and other factors would be considered. The frequency of the software, etc. We get that information from the BDU side, and we have to note that the BDU data has a WAL incident flag that shows that the vulnerability is being used in hacking attacks, in real incidences. So that means that this is similar to SIPA-KEF. On the website, this field is not featured, but it would be featured in the file that you may download. If you prioritize CV vulnerabilities, the BDU vulnerabilities would be attached, so you may use the source of BDU, and it works very fast. Again, you make a request for the whole BDU database, and it is about 15 megabyte size, and it would be analyzed immediately. These are the reports generated on the vulnerabilities without CVEs. There are about 1,364 such vulnerabilities with exploits, a little bit more, and only 17 with incidents. Sadly, I paid more attention to the last report because it was easier to consider manually. Again, this is my report. I saw that most of vulnerabilities are RCE, certainly, because they are most interesting for the attackers, for the hackers. But what is peculiar, not all the software. That's the Russian-made software, and we could assume that the vulnerabilities without CVE are also Russian ones. Now, we would see that most of them are open source projects, and there are some Western commercial projects, and Google Chrome, for instance, also can be attributed to that, and there are just 2 Russian-made products. If we go on looking at the products and we take all those vulnerabilities without CV identifiers, 1364, then it would have 377 products, and you cannot analyze that manually. But if you just take a general view, the products written in Cyrillic are 63, using Cyrillic in its name. If we look at top products with vulnerabilities, then it would look like that. And we see that, again, Most of the products are the Russian ones, but still there are Windows and Linux vulnerabilities. And you may ask a question how they got there. Most of the vulnerabilities in the Russian-made products are in Astra. In that case, this is Basha vulnerability. And it should be typical of all the Linux distributors. And this is a result of a research of Astra team. And it's been found only in Astra directories, not elsewhere. And it was not in CV, it was in BDU only. Now there is EMIAS OS, and this vulnerability is attributable to Linux kernel, and it would be strange if it concerns only one distribution and doesn't concern other directories, and there are no CV detectors. This is a question to the bulletin that probably CV is not attached. In terms of Windows, that's an interesting case. Part of the vulnerabilities are reported as advisories, and then CVEs might be distributed, might be assigned, but they just are not reported in BDU. So Windows vulnerability now is without CV identifier. Here you may see a different approach. The vulnerability actually was distributed as a bulletin with no CV, and then for such DSH, the CVE identifiers were attached, but it was not reported on the BDU. Another widespread case, this is an open source software, which is exploit-driven. So there is an exploit in which description you cannot find CVE, and you do not know what CVE is. I understand that you take an exploit and you make a BDU identifier to make sure that this exploit is considered somehow. And there are lots of such vulnerabilities there. And those 17 cases are probably attributed to that situation. And there are vendors who do not like to get CVE identifiers for their vulnerabilities, for instance, SAP. So they would actually describe vulnerabilities in the SAP notes, and they do not get any CVEs. Therefore, some SAP vulnerabilities are present in BDU, but they are not in the NVD database. So what conclusions we can make? It is surprising that the NVD problem cannot be solved. So the problem started in February. And I thought that probably it could be resolved by the end of May, but there is no way out, and I do not know how it may end. So the main conclusion I can make, and BDU is 5 times less than NVD, and now BDU, this is in complement to NVD rather than its replacement. Should it concern only the Russian-made software or the software which is being used in Russia? This is an open question, and we will leave that for our subsequent discussion that would follow our report. Next, in order to go on analyzing the BDU, we could look at the product statistics. For instance, operational systems or applied software, and what kind of applied software. We can get a good statistics, but now it's very difficult to do, because now, in the best case scenario, the software, which somehow is connected to the Russian software register, where it is just a software which cannot be mapped on the CP
Если бы
It would be good
софты,
if
уязвимости для которых
software
выявлены в БДО,
for which vulnerabilities are reported on BDU are described somewhere and somehow.
ну и, как я показал, уязвимости в БДО
And as I
без
said,
ЦВЕ это не всегда
vulnerabilities in
уязвимость
BDU without
отечественных
CVE not
продуктов. Ну,
necessarily
даже
are the
зачастую уязвимости
vulnerabilities
в
in the
отечественном
Russian-made
продукте.
products, and
И
most frequently
хорошо,
these are
на
not
самом
the
деле,
Russian-made
что эти
product, and that's
уязвимости
good. That's
учтены
good that
хотя
these
бы таким
vulnerabilities
образом,
at least
хотя бы
are
в БДО.
taken into account, at least in BDU.
Про аномалии, которые я подсвечивал, ну,
Abnormalities in BDU, which
то,
I've
что там нету
highlighted.
CVE-шного
That's true.
идентификатора, это просто
Sometimes
там
there is no
ошибки,
CVE
результаты
identified. This
как
is a
ошибки
result
в
of a
описании
mistake.
могут быть.
Mistake in
Благо,
the
есть
description can occur.
способ о них сообщить. На
That's good that there
сайте
is a way to report on
БДО
that.
есть e-mail, куда
On
можно
the
написать,
BDU website, there is an email you can use in order to report about that, and the analyst would
Ну и
correct
последнее,
the mistake. And the last but not least,
поддерживает БДО.
Louristics, Vulnerabilities now supports BDU, can use
Он
it.
строит отчеты и
It builds reports
например.
and can be very handy.
Скачивайте, пробуйте.
So you're free to download it and try it once again. Thank you so much for your attention. Subscribe to my Telegram channel, Vulnerability Management, etc. Leonov.Rus. And now let's answer the questions that you sent to me on the chat box.
Так, вопросы из аудитории.
The questions from the audience. How to explain the statuses ejected and disputed, and what we can do about those statuses? In statistics, well, you mean the status of CV vulnerabilities in NVD. Whether these vulnerabilities, disputed and rejected, affect the overall number of vulnerabilities and statistics. Well, somehow they may impact that, but not significantly. So how do I treat that? I think that this is rather a question to MITRA and the National Vulnerability Database in ISTR Institute to make sure that they work better with the analysts, to make sure that there are less such vulnerabilities. But for our work, let us just filter that and disregard that. When there would be the vulnerability search product for home use. That's a good question. I can redirect that to vulnerability management directors, marketing department. I can answer it the following way. In the West, there is a solution for detecting vulnerabilities, which are either free for home, for family, with some limitation in terms of the number of IP, or they are either cheap or free, but the vendor is unlikely to survive just issuing and releasing such free products, or the ones which are quite cheap for home use. Usually, there would be one big vendor, and it may decide that for some marketing purposes or for some other purposes, it would make sense to make a product in such a niche.
And people don't have understanding that the product designed to detect vulnerabilities should be bought for money, like any antivirus software with viruses. People understand that, which is not the case with vulnerabilities. My answer will be yes. It would be great if we could have products belonging to different price categories. If your internal infrastructure is not huge, you can identify your vulnerabilities manually using the same identifier which I demonstrated with NVD. Not trustworthy is the evaluation of threats from FSTEC. Don't we require a more reliable expert evaluation of severity? In my opinion, the difference between NIST, NVD, and STEC
не такая существенная.
in terms of evaluations is not huge.
Я думаю, плюс-минус одинаковый.
The level of expertise seems to be equal.
Более точной экспертной оценки, возможно,
As
имеет
to more
смысл
accurate expert evaluation,
каким-то краудфандингом, не краудфандингом,
probably
а краудсорсингом,
some
собирать мнение
crowdsourcing might
комьюнити
help.
и каким-то образом его учитывать.
Where the community feedback could be collected
Высказать
and
свое
taken
мнение
into
по
account
той или иной
to
уязвимости
come up
СВЕ,
with
там,
one's own
БДУшной.
opinion on
Я
any
думаю, что
vulnerability,
это
whether
не
it is
вопрос
CVE
самой
or
БДУшной базы.
CVE. However, it's not the
Это
question
вопрос
to be
скорее
addressed to
сервисов,
the
которые могут
database of
вырастать из вот этой
vulnerabilities.
вот инфраструктуры
This question
БДУшной базы, потому что,
should rather be
кажется,
addressed to the
регулятор в виде
services
БДУ все сделал
growing
уже,
out of it,
он
because the
отдал
regulator
свои данные в виде
apparently
XML.
has
Вы
done
можете их
everything, having
использовать,
yielded
в том
the
числе
XML data, and you can
производя
use it
переоценку критичности, если считаете, что это нужно.
to reevaluate the
Проверялись ли
severity
причины
of
отсутствия ссылок
vulnerabilities.
на ЦВЕ в БДУ? Может ли это
Have you
просто быть
checked
ошибкой
the
заполнения,
lack
а не
of
уникальной уязвимостью? Ну, как я,
data?
собственно, и показывал, проверялись
Well, as I
выборочно,
demonstrated, yes,
и зачастую
such
это,
checks,
ну, иногда это
partial
действительно
checks,
ошибки, иногда
have been done. In
оно
some
действительно
cases,
так. То есть есть уязвимость,
they are
в
errors.
ЦВЕшке,
In
National
some other
Vulnerability
cases,
Database.
they are true vulnerabilities
Вопросы
with no
кончились.
accompanying CVEs.
Спасибо
Any
вам
more
большое за
questions?
внимание.
Well, obviously, we're done
И
with questions.
оставайтесь
Thank
на
you very
дискуссию,
much
которая
for
будет
your attention.
буквально
And
через
I encourage
8
you
минут.
to stay for the discussion that's going to be kicked off in 10 minutes. 10 minutes.